Many thanks, as always, going out to the Gender Wave for taking us through yet another Thursday morning. We have arrived, all of us together, at yet another Thursday afternoon. Here on 90.7 FM, KALX Berkeley, and wherever you are as well. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gregory Scharpen, and this is indeed the program Arts in Review. We'll be here for the next half hour. In a few moments, after he winds his way through the construction maze that is the city of Berkeley, we will be talking with Norman G. Of the Oakland Public Theater about the Baldwin Centennial Project, which is going to be moving. It was playing over in San Francisco at the Potrero stage and is now moving over to BAM House in Oakland. We're going to be talking about 100 years of James Baldwin. So he will be arriving momentarily to talk us through this long gestating project and about 100 years of Baldwin. So stick around. In a few moments, a conversation with Norman G. Here for you on 90.7 FM, KALX Berkeley, Arts in Review. Just in time.
I love it.
Norman G. having braved the construction labyrinth that is the city of Berkeley.
And the renaming of buildings, which is always okay.
Oh, right. Oh, that guy was kind of a jerk. I guess we can't use that name, but now where am I going?
I now know that in the future, nobody will know my name because at some point I will be called out and my name will be erased. Which is a comfort.
Exactly. No one really needs to know me.
No. If you're not around, you don't need to know.
Exactly. Thank you so much for coming in.
I'm so happy.
I guess we should talk just kind of to set the groundwork of this project and kind of I know it's been at least 2 years in the making, probably more. So let's talk about the gestation of this and this is now you're moving from San Francisco to Oakland. So you've had a run of this.
We did a sneak preview. We just did one weekend, the weekend. So this is the James Baldwin Centennial Project. And we have created, we being Oakland Public Theater, my little company, has created a new piece called, not that part, Inventory, James Baldwin Abroad. And that was our way of celebrating the centennial. So, yeah, the birthday was August 2nd. So we did a soft opening in San Francisco for the weekend. And now we're doing our official, bells and whistles opening in downtown Oakland at the BAM House, which used to be the flight deck.
And then was Piano Fight.
And then was Piano Fight.
Now it's Low Bottom Players, I think.
They're managing it. But it's a black arts, they want there to be a black arts, I guess, movement, but a district, a cultural district. Yeah, that's CDC is their cultural district,
right, yes.
Something.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, so we are guests. And under that banner of black arts, which I guess James Baldwin fits in.
I guess you could call him that. Were there any sort of revelations from the soft opening? That worked better than I thought, or I need to.
Oh, mostly because I am in therapy to get used to the idea that I must make space for the positive in my life because I'm always paying attention to every little detail of what went wrong or what needs fixing. So it was a joy to hear from audience that they enjoyed it, that they got a lot out of it, and that it made them curious and eager to learn more. And I'm like, that is the mission of this project. So that was wonderful. My therapist, of all people, I won't call him out by name, but he said, I wanted to see what you were doing. So San Francisco was streaming our last show in Oakland on September 1st. It's a matinee, 2:00, and that will be live stream. So he just streamed it, and he was like, wow, it was so... Now I understand you. And I'm like, I'm a little afraid of that statement, but okay.
The idea of James Baldwin abroad, I think, is a really interesting lens through this. I mean, I think it's fairly well known that James Baldwin spent a fair amount of time abroad. I was not personally aware of quite how abroad he went.
So this all started with a Richard Wright Centennial many years ago, which I think I came in and talked about.
Yes.
And Baldwin was one of a number of people who were inspired by Wright and left the United States, which at that point was a segregated place. And every time most of them would come back to visit, they'd still go, in that other country, I'm a cherished guest. And here, not so much. So most of them didn't stay. Baldwin spent most of his life in Paris.
In Paris, yeah.
But we found out that there was this decade. There's a book, Magdalena Zaborowska, I believe her name is, a Polish woman who became fascinated with Baldwin and was fascinated that few people knew that he spent a decade, 1961 to 1971, in Istanbul, in Turkey.
That was the bit that I was completely unaware of. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was like, well, so what are we going to do with that? Because for our Richard Wright piece, we focused on the end of his life and used that as sort of a framing device for everything else we wanted to talk about him. It's easy to talk about the past from a present moment, and that was our present moment. With this one, I didn't want to talk about the end of Baldwin's life. I don't think there's anything particularly notable about it, and it's a little sad, honestly. He was happy and was living the life he wanted in the south of France. I believe it's now what is part of the French Riviera, but back then it was a little lower rent. But it was comfortable for him, and he basically had an ongoing salon for years. And people like Miles Davis came through, Nina Simone. There's a painter, Buford Delaney, I think his name is. Folks that just sort of hung out and enjoyed the party. And I learned all kinds of things, like Baldwin spent his days, he would spend his nights writing. He would write late into the night, and then he would wake up the next morning, get some coffee and stuff, and he would sit down and want to read to anybody who was around what he had been working on. And that was his process. So we found that fascinating. He did a lot. We start with, so his third novel, his first novel is Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is semi-autobiographical. His second novel is Giovanni's Room, which is about a gay relationship, which in the early 50s was a pretty racy novel. Yeah. But he also, I'm sure it is talked about, but maybe not as much. He intentionally did not want to be pigeonholed as a Negro writer, so he wrote a story about white people. So the main character is white. Most of the main characters are white. He wanted to kind of free himself in that way. His third novel is Another Country, and he says he spent a decade or almost a decade trying to get it to work, and he just couldn't. So he had met this Turkish actor who said, well, why don't you come stay with us? And he went, and they said within months, he cranked it out, got it to the publisher. It was published and, to much acclaim. So now he's kind of comfortable. He's also flush. And he's like, what do I want to do and what do I want to be? And I feel like there's a lot of that decade where he explores all of that and is able to kind of shed some of the places and things that he has been so that he can get to that hopefully joyful place in the south of France. So we get him to Istanbul, and then we get him at that point where he goes, I'm done.
Why then, if Istanbul was sort of this place of unlocking, why then the move to France? Why did he decide
Why did he go back?
Why did he go to France?
And see, this is like, I, Norman, have lots of opinions. I try not to bring them into the process as much as possible. I want to root. And so what we do is it's all text. It's Baldwin text. It's people writing about Baldwin. So we frame everything that we want to deal with in that context. But Norman's belief is being other is a little strange. So I think when he was in Paris, he kept coming back to New York, kept coming back to the States. Mm-hmm. He wanted to be a part of change and movement. And I think every time he came back, he saw that it really wasn't moving that fast. When you debate William F. Buckley and he says, I can imagine maybe 40 years from now that a Negro could be president. 40 years when you're a grown man is like, so you're saying maybe in my lifetime and maybe not. And I think
if I live healthy, maybe in my lifetime.
But I think the other thing for him with Paris was he became a celebrity. And so you are other and you are exotic other. And I think he didn't like that. But I think there was something about Turkey that allowed him to be a totally different kind of exotic other. And at a certain point, I think he was done with that. He was like, okay, let me go back to what I know. And instead of going back to Paris, went to the south of France.
Yeah, I mean, Paris to me seems to, especially at that time, there's a sort of a literati kind of sense to the idea of Paris. And, you know, there were a lot of writers and a lot of artists, kind of expats going to Paris. So there seems like there's kind of an American community that was there already.
It's still, and it's interesting. I've gotten to go. I've acted with Word for Word and taken 2 shows to Paris, and you know, it was like the last one was last year. So yeah, the other one was 2018. So 5 years in between, you could feel the difference, and it was like, oh, okay, so things are changing. Lots of halal tacos. Big thing over there.
Wow.
All over Paris. And like, oh, okay, that's crazy. And it looks like a fast food joint. So we're like, yeah, we're not going there. Burgers and things like that have grown up. So there's a lot of what we would think of as American, but I think it's just sort of been, you know, it's capitalist, ubiquitous.
It's the same thing everywhere in the world.
We were on the train. My wife came over at the end of our performance tour, and we went to London. And on the train over to London, we recognized the accent of 2 California girls, and they were bemoaning the fact that no restaurant that they went to in Paris had ranch dressing. Yeah, the world we live in. So I feel like Baldwin got to Paris and enjoyed a certain amount of freedom, and then gained a sort of, you know, not infamy, but notoriety that, you know, he became a celebrity. And that wasn't what he wanted either. So we get to touch on everything. And what we did was, if you remember the documentary, I'm Not Your Negro, we've sort of created little chapters. I'm not your native son. I'm not your black boy. I'm not your holy roller. I'm not your playwright.
Activist.
I'm not your black activist. Yeah. Because throughout his life, when somebody would try to label him like, are you an activist? Are you part of the civil rights movement? He would say, I'm a citizen. I'm a concerned citizen. I'm a witness. And in so many ways, I feel like that's who he was. So I feel like what happened in Istanbul is he kind of got to go, I like where I've been and what I've done. I see where there are some avenues that I'm no longer going to pursue. You know, like civil rights, by the time Baldwin is that chronicler at the beginning of the 60s of what's going on in America in the civil rights movement, at the end of it, by the time you get to Black Power, there's a whole militancy and a youth that is no longer willing to put on a suit and tie and have a polite conversation with Kennedy. Buckley or Kennedy or any of those. And Baldwin he's always loved fashion, but I think it just went someplace that he wasn't quite comfortable with. And so we try to touch on all these things. The other big challenge I felt like I had was Baldwin writes a very male perspective. And I was like, well, where are the women? And how do I get women into this story? He references his mother all over the place. And in his later novels, the female characters start to have more voice. But in Giovanni's Room, the main character is engaged to get married. By the time that woman shows up in the story, you have no sympathy. Any sympathy you have for her is so overwhelmed by this huge homosexual love that you've just embraced. You just can't go there. So I was like, well, where do we get that from? So we cheated a little bit with sort of a prologue with Lorraine Hansberry and that Robert F. Kennedy meeting. There's a famous Robert F. Kennedy meeting in the early 60s that did not go well.
No.
But Robert F. Kennedy says that because of that, or it is said because of that, and even Robert F. Kennedy references it, that he was able to get President Kennedy to make a landmark civil rights speech that year. So that was positive. But so we had to introduce, like, who is Lorraine Hansberry? Who is she to Baldwin? And they have a beautiful mutual appreciation society going. And then slam right into that meeting. At the end, as an epilogue, we have Nikki Giovanni, who at that point was a young black writer. And she represents very much the perspective of her generation. And Baldwin is still talking, you know, at least a decade earlier. He's trying, and you see that in this. You can see the conversation. It's available on YouTube. It was turned into a book, too, that is no longer in print, but it's called A Dialogue. And it's Nikki Giovanni interviewing, supposedly, James Baldwin. It's a conversation. It goes back and forth beautifully. There's an incredible level of respect, even though they clearly have very different perspectives. And so it's gorgeous to kind of see him wanting to appreciate and to try to reframe what she's saying in his context and having some success, but really kind of a little bit out of step.
Here's where I'm coming from. Where are you coming from? Right, yeah.
And so it turns out that interview happened that same year that he went back to Paris. It just was a few months later. So, I mean, there was so much material we couldn't get in. Margaret Mead, there's a similar dialogue, and you can find that online. Really? Margaret Mead, who is an older woman, talking to a younger James Baldwin. It's just fascinating.
Wow, that's another one that I wasn't aware had happened.
Yeah, no, there's just the gorgeous stuff. People might know that he's a playwright, but they probably don't know he's a poet. And so right before the end of his life, there was published a book of his poetry. I believe it's called Jimmy's Blues. And so there's one of the larger poems in it called Inventory, which is where we take the title of our piece, Inventory / on being 52. Now, he's not 52. He's just short of 52 when he leaves Istanbul. But since we start with him talking about a novel that he started and couldn't finish until he got to Istanbul, I'm going to suppose that maybe he is working on this poem, this large poem, and that has become kind of the spine of our show. And I love it because he explores in the poem the idea that he is searching, he's on a journey to the Palace of Wisdom. And all these little things that he references throughout the poem, I have turned into pieces. They have helped us to sort of hang these different stories and things off of. The little boy with the brown ball, the howling man, which is one that I would love to see if somebody's actually done a good analysis of this poem. Nothing I've read points to it. But who the hell is the howling man? Well, if you're talking early 50s, there's a howling man.
There's a howling man.
There's a howling man. And if you saw the movie Howl with James Franco, I'm watching this movie and enjoying it thoroughly, but I'm really confused why they have this hot young guy playing the guy that I knew as a kid as a bespectacled, balding, little stubby Jew. I'm like, why? And then at the end of the film, they showed stills from the movie alongside black and white photos of the time. Ginsberg was a hottie. And you could see where Ginsberg, and he became that superstar, right? The poetry superstar. So I can't help but imagine that a young James Baldwin trying to find his voice as a gay man wouldn't be intrigued with that, the power of that. I mean, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. That's pretty powerful. So, yeah, there are things like that that we do get to touch on, and that's been fun to keep coming back to this poem. And it also amazed me. Baldwin died when he was 63. I started this process when I was 63. I will turn 65 in October. So I guess I was on my way to 63, because you're right. We started earlier than that. But I was like, wow, thinking about what your life is and where you've been, but where you're going, you're not done yet. And so it's easy for me to envision our James Baldwin on that journey. Doesn't matter how many mountain peaks you've been on, is there another mountain? Yeah. And this one's cold, or this one's lonely, or this one, everybody shuns me. And so, yeah, he's always moving forward. And so we got to hang that, hang our piece on that. And we got to do a series of readings, developing aspects of this. So we did some of Giovanni's room. And it was so satisfying to have audience come up afterwards and say, oh, my God, I grew up on that book. I love that story. And I'm like, so you're talking about a story from the mid-50s, but you can't help, you still thinking about it. Yay. And then last November, we did poetry. And what we did was Richard Talavera, my good friend and playwright, is part of a poetry group. And they meet monthly, but every now and then they pick a poet and they say, use this for inspiration for our next meeting. So they decided to use Baldwin last year. And I went and I saw and heard these poems. And I was like, can I use these? So we put together a piece that included a couple of Baldwin poems, a County Cullen, who was the other one. So I remember as a young man getting a set of trading cards, but it was African-American historical figures. And County Cullen was one of them. And I was like, mostly it was light-skinned dudes. And I was like, I don't know who that is, and why should I care? And I read the back of the card, and I'm like, Harlem Renaissance poet. No, that's Langston Hughes. What? What? Well, it turns out that the Harlem Renaissance actually had sort of two waves. And that first wave, County Cullen was the premier writer, the poet. And held onto that title, I think, for the rest of his life, even though the world kind of moved on. He ends up being one of James Baldwin's teachers, actually gets Baldwin inspired to write poetry and to write, and makes him the editor of his middle school newspaper. So
when you say teacher, early teacher.
Early
Wow.
teacher and early talent.
Mm-hmm.
He says, County Cullen says that he recognized right off the bat that this was the raw talent in his school's most gifted writing student. So we've got little pieces of that in, and then we intersperse them with these modern contemporary poems, including one which I actually got the poet in trouble for because she's a white woman and she has a mixed race grandchild who she wrote about with this in mind. And it was, I thought, one of the most beautiful pieces we had last year. And apparently her granddaughter got in touch with her very upset. You know, she's a grown, like almost middle-aged woman now. And she's like, you didn't ask my permission. You can't do that. And she's like, it's a poem. And then she actually looked up the legality of it. It's like, yeah, unless I say Gregory Scharpen, no, I have to add your middle initial. Unless I like target you in my work to say, oh, that's uncomfortably like me, unless I can prove in a court, that is me. That's my story that you're telling. And it wasn't. It was a beautiful poem. It was beautiful to put that together. And that was when I realized, oh, that's the spine of our piece. And then I looked at the Turkey stuff and I went, oh, we are so not going to live in Turkey. But he didn't. He went back and forth. He kept going back to Paris to see publishers, to see friends. He kept coming back to the States, civil rights, New York, but also through the South. He kept traveling to see the civil rights stuff that was going on too and be involved in things. And again, pieces that I couldn't get in. In the 1963 March on Washington, which everybody knows, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, he was originally listed as one of the speakers. Mm-hmm. And nobody bothered to tell him before he had flown back in that he was no longer on the list. And I think when you think Bayard Rustin, you know, is the architect of that thing, and he removed himself because he's like, I'm gay and I'm a communist. They're just going to attack us. So I'm sure as they looked at the list, it's like, well, if I'm not speaking, Baldwin's not speaking, no. But yeah, little pieces like that we couldn't get in, but it's to me, and it's something we were just, we did a pickup rehearsal last night, touching on that thread of this isn't working anymore. You might have been the voice of the civil rights movement, early 60s, but by the late 60s, that movement is trying to go places and you don't know how to go there. Then you start losing your dear friends. Malcolm X assassinated, you know, Martin, Medgar
Evers, yeah.
Yeah, and of course Kennedy. Yeah, it's just like don't need to go back there. Mm-hmm. Going back there is now, seriously, it was already dangerous.
Yes.
Now it's not just dangerous, they're just freely killing you. And he decides he can just take it easy and stay over in Europe. And then Istanbul, I want to touch on that just a little bit because I didn't realize, one, just map-wise, I just didn't realize where. And so as I'm watching it, first thing I grabbed onto and had to let go of was the Orient Express, because that's where it went. At one point, it went from London to Istanbul. Mm-hmm. And it goes all the way across Europe. Well, it's right across the river, so it is kind of Europe, and it is kind of that east beyond there, you know, India and all that.
Istanbul is the fulcrum around so many things, yeah.
Well, and then as I did my research, the people in it are quick to distance themselves from North Africa and the Arabs. They say it with a P, Arabs. And they call Jimmy their little Arab. There was a term for cannibal. That was the other term and basically it's this sort of racialized language. But thankfully, the biographer that I was drawing from is quick to clock herself on her cultural lens and say, they seemed very comfortable. Nobody seemed to feel like it was a particular, it's like if I called you boy, you know, it's different. If you call me boy, and actually,
connotations that are,
it's not our reality.
Right.
but there is a reality
A
there.
generational reality.
And yeah, so apparently that's not there for them. So again, I think it felt for Baldwin, it's like, wow, you guys are kind of like that, but you're also kind of like that, but you're kind of like that. And you refuse to let anybody box you in. I came home. I could see where he just kind of went, oh, let me be me.
Wow, we are running out of time.
I talk a lot.
No, there were so many other things that I wanted to get to talk about in terms of just the construction of the piece. But we will have to do it for another time, I'm afraid. We should mention the specifics once again.
Sure.
That Inventory, James Baldwin Abroad, will be at the BAM House, for people who are maybe unfamiliar with that name. Again, it was originally the Flight Deck and then was Piano Fight for a little bit right there, where Telegraph slams into Broadway.
Yep, 15th and Broadway.
15th,
block off of
1540, I think, is the address?
1540, and it's right between the two BART stations downtown Oakland, so it's so easy to get to.
And it's the next 2 weekends. What are the
next 2 weekends? It's August 22nd is our preview. 23rd we open in Oakland, and then we'll run through September 1st, which is a Sunday. 2:00 matinees on Sundays, Thursday through Saturday, 8:00.
And that last Sunday will be streamed online.
And the last Sunday will be streamed online. And I should say it is no one turned away for lack of funds. So we would love as much money as you can give us, but please don't let that stop you. I do have to say also, especially for the streaming, you have to get a ticket in advance because they send you a link. Because we're doing this under a SAG agreement, which is the only way I can do it. SAG is a sister union to Equity. And so I can do that, but that means we're broadcasting, but that means we report back to SAG what our numbers are, who saw the show, and if somehow we're a runaway hit, the actors actually get paid more money. Yay, SAG.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. A streaming would have to, it's on a screen, so yes, SAG.
Yeah, just another benefit of the COVID lockdown.
Yeah. For people who are interested, where is the website that they should go?
BaldwinCentennialProject.com, all one word, BaldwinCentennialProject.com, and that will take you to, that'll take you to our website, and then we have a ticketing page, and that'll take you to a ticketing page. You will immediately be presented with a money figure, and you can just hit the drop-down menu and drop down or up as much as you want.
Norman G. from the Oakland Public Theater, thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
You too. This is KALX Berkeley 9.7 FM. This has been the Program Arts Interview. I am Gregory Scharpen. Coming up momentarily, we'll be Little Anna to take you up to 3 o'clock, sitting in for Madam X today. Everybody out there, take care and have a good Thursday.